It was when I was at Barovier in Tasso, the glass blowers on Murano. I was watching the master glass blower literally blow into the tube to create the glass. It was during an Italian heat wave, so it was about 150 degrees in this room with the furnaces, just blasting heat. And everyone's dripping sweat. And one of the associates that was kind of taking me around, she turned to me and she said, every time he blows into the glass, he blows a piece of his soul into the work.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, the podcast seeking wisdom in business, investing, systems, and the art of paying attention. Each episode uncovers stories from practitioners who have spent years pursuing multi-generational excellence in their craft. We are seeking to understand how the world really works and how we can align our actions to it. I am your host, John Candito, and this is our series on the art of quality in investing.
John Candito is the founder and managing partner of the Phronesis Fund, the lead sponsor of this series. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not investment advice. The podcast host, guests, and clients of the Phronesis Fund may maintain positions in securities that are discussed.
Our guest today is Eric Markowitz. Eric is a partner and the director of research at investment firm Nightview Capital and a former investigative journalist with bylines in The New Yorker, GQ, Fast Company, and other outlets. As you will learn in this episode, a near-death experience prompted Eric to wonder why some cultures, companies, and products dramatically outlast others. Eric is traveling the globe, from Central American rainforests to centuries-old businesses in Europe and Asia, on a quest to answer one question: what allows a rare few systems to outlast? His forthcoming book, titled Outlast, will be published by Scribner, the flagship imprint of Simon & Schuster and home to legends like Ernest Hemingway and F. Fitzgerald. Eric has just returned from his trips through Italy, the United States, and Japan, and in this episode we are learning from Eric's notes from the field. This one was fascinating. Please enjoy our conversation with Eric Markowitz. Eric, welcome to The Art of Quality.
Thank you, John.
Excited to have you here. A lot of turf to cover. You're writing a book called Outlast, and you had a very profound story that led to your interest in answering questions like what endures and what doesn't. And so could you share that story with us?
Sure. The genesis of this project started about 2.5 years ago. I got really sick, and basically doctors couldn't really figure out what was wrong with me. My primary symptom was intense vertigo and dizziness and nausea, and initially went to the hospital, and they did the stroke protocol, did an MRI of my brain, came back totally normal. I got discharged, but kept getting worse and worse, went back to the hospital, and for about a month was just sort of living in this kind of hellish purgatory of room was constantly spinning, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I lost about 30, 40 pounds in about a month. And so finally my wife, thankfully, called our doctors and got a second MRI ordered, and came out of the MRI, and the technician tapped my shoulder and said, "You have to talk to the radiologist." So they called the radiologist and said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but it looks like you have a rapidly enhancing lesion on your brainstem, and it looks like it could be a stage 4 glioblastoma, which is terminal brain cancer, and you need to get to the ER right away." And so this was January of 2023. I was 35. We had an 18-month-old daughter. Went to the hospital. My wife met me there. I couldn't drive at this point, so a good friend of mine had been kind of ferrying me around to doctor's appointments. And that night at the hospital, the neurologist said, "Yeah, you need to have surgery. We don't know what it is. It could be a stage 4 glioblastoma. If it is, and you do survive the surgery, you have about 3 months left to live." And the surgery was scheduled for the next day, just purely out of serendipity. My closest friend in Portland, Oregon, where I live, I talked to him. He said, "Let's call Zach." And Zach was our mutual friend who's a brain surgeon. Zach took a look at my scans that evening and decided he was going to do the surgery. And, surgery was scheduled for the next day. So that night, I wrote a goodbye letter to my daughter, and I kind of prayed, and my family boarded a flight out west and woke up the next morning after the craniotomy, and my brain surgeon was standing there. It was in the ICU, and I said, "Is it cancer?" And he said, "I don't think so." And it took a couple of days for the pathology to come back, but it turns out that it was this sort of walnut-sized abscess that had formed in the center of my cerebellum on my brainstem that was just this weird bacterial infection that no doctor to this day can explain why it got there. So I had about 3 months of intravenous IV, about 9 times a day, kind of blasting my body with chemo-like therapy to just kill all the potential bacteria that was causing this infection. But I survived. And it was a profoundly moving and eye-opening experience for me about what my life looked like beforehand and what it looks like now. And that goodbye letter that I wrote the night before the surgery ultimately became the seed for this project that I'm working on now, which is a fundamental exploration of what it takes to survive, what it takes to endure, how do things last a really long time, why do things die? And my vehicle for exploring this is looking at businesses in particular that have survived for hundreds, and in a couple of cases, more than 1,000 years. So I started my career as a business journalist. I've been an investor for the last 10 years. I've always been fascinated by the world of business and investing because for me, business is really it's a constellation of factors that ultimately underpin all of society and culture. And so I don't think you can separate business from life itself. And so by analyzing these institutions that have lasted for a really long time, what I'm uncovering is a pattern or framework of endurance that can be applied to your own life, that can be applied to your business, an investing strategy, a career, a family. And that's why I've been traveling over the last 12 months around the world to meet with these people who run these organizations. And I'm hoping to distill this down into a book that will come out in 2027 or 2028 with Simon & Schuster. It's called Outlast. That is really kind of a playbook or a manual for long-term thinking in a world that I believe has become increasingly short-term and fragile.
Wow. What a story. Thank you for sharing that with us. What was so link it together for us a little bit. So you had that intense period of, health care and recovery. You wrote the letter. What's the story from sort of letter to I need to go route a lot of time and energy to studying this intensely?
Yeah, it wasn't linear, right? So like all things in life, they kind of coalesce over time. And coming out of the surgery, I was just recovering. I was just really, in a lot of ways, I was experiencing what people call survivor's euphoria, which is just this overwhelming emotion that a lot of people go through that have near-death experiences. And I just wanted to keep writing to my daughter. And so I had that document open and I just kept jotting down ideas, just sort of wisdom that I had picked up along the way. And in truth, the book really actually started as kind of a continuation letter, and it was like letters to be. And I just kept writing and talking to people and having different ideas about what I wanted my daughter to really embrace throughout her life that would just keep her grounded and give her an instruction manual for me, because it was so sort of top of mind and so, I guess, pressing that I felt that she was so young, I hadn't been able to offer her what I wanted to offer her. And as I was writing to her and I had a lot of time because I was taking a lot of time off of work, I took off about 6 months, I got very curious about what has actually survived. And I was pretty limited mobility wise. I was in a walker for a period of time, but thankfully I could sit in a chair and have my laptop, and just started Googling like the world's oldest businesses, and realized like, oh, there's not much out there. I mean, there's like a kind of crummy Wikipedia page, but it's all of the analysis was like fairly biblical in a way. It was like, and Joseph passed the business on to Benjamin, and Benjamin passed the business on to Daniel. And I just kept thinking like, there's got to be more here, because like, how do these people operate these institutions that continue that legacy and have a succession that goes from one family member to the next family member? And there's so much wisdom in order to keep these institutions alive. And as I was just kind of pursuing this, I decided I'm going to start writing about this publicly. And so that's when I started writing a column for Big Think called The Long Game. And that was a column that just kind of continued to explore this idea of what lasts in a world that has become very, very myopically focused on the now. And I think that we have all of the technology that enables us to access all of the world's information instantaneously. But that instantaneous nature of technology is a real double-edged sword. It speeds things up, and that speed causes a lot of entropy, and entropy often causes chaos and disaster. And so just looking objectively at what's happening in the world of business in particular is corporate lifespans are plummeting, employee turnover is incredibly high, the level of burnout that people are feeling is just basically exponentially rising. I think the number one like Google search term was something like, how to deal with burnout from life in 2020 and 2021. And so I started seeing this pattern of, okay, people are feeling like desperately tired and burnt out, and everything feels like it's changing so fast, and things are kind of like constantly falling apart, from government to business to even kind of religious institutions. There's been this sort of like complete collapse of institutions. And as I continued to write about that, one of the columns that I was writing in Big Think actually was about Nintendo. And I was on a plane, I was writing this column about how Nintendo has actually started in the late 1800s. And I remember turning to my wife and I said, I think there's a book in this idea, in this like one sentence, that, hey, this business has been around for like 130 years or so, 140 years. And there's a lot of other businesses that have been around for a long time, but no one's really kind of done the work to go into these businesses and talk to these people, and not just from like a quantitative academic perspective, study how many old businesses there are, but really talk to the multi-generational owners and the caretakers of these businesses. So that's a little kind of like deeper behind the scenes of how this all coalesced together. And it continues to evolve, because I am trying to approach this really like with an open heart and an open mind, and go into these places not really with like a fixed perspective of what I'm hoping to find, but just talk to people. And it's, for me, the most gratifying, fulfilling, fun project of my life, which totally marries what I love doing, which is like research and writing and business and investing and storytelling. So, I spent 10 years as a journalist, and now I'm kind of like rekindling that early passion for storytelling through this vehicle that is incredibly helpful as an investor, which is what I do now professionally.
I love it. That's one of the things you told me that really surprised me. And then I went and looked, and of course you were right, is nobody's really sort of put together the compendium of the world's oldest businesses. And that's one of those things, when you frame it that way, it just seems so obvious that there's probably important kind of species level, important wisdom there. It must be out there somewhere. And you go, look, it's like, nope.
Yeah, it was completely surprising. I mean, there's, not to discredit any of the academic work that's been done. There's been some really great books like Ethan Hawken. It's on my desk right here, Lessons from Century Club Companies. I mean, there are books, but her book was particularly focused on U.S. businesses. And that's a very, very small category of old businesses. So you're right. I mean, I'm treating this kind of like part journalist, part anthropologist, part scientist, part academic, part, just curious guy that's just eager to kind of distill all of this down and create this compendium. And so what I'm doing is creating a database that I'm hoping to make public in the next few years that will serve as a research platform for other people who are curious about this subject and want to go deeper, maybe whether it's on a specific geography or a specific type of business, and make that publicly available so that it can be studied. Because to your point, it's like from a scientific perspective, there's just not that much data on it.
Yeah, I, amongst many others, will be an eager consumer of that database. So you figured out pretty quickly you're going to have to hit the road. And so tell us that story. So you are starting to pull together this database. You realize that there's, let's just say, businesses that have survived, the rare cases of businesses that survived a long time, but they're all over the world.
Yeah.
And so what was the first trip? How did you even just figure out where to go and who to talk to and have a door to walk into when you landed? Tell us that story.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of street photographers like Gary Winogrand, and their process is like they kind of just take a camera out to the street and just start taking pictures. So it's a bit of shooting from the hip. But I started putting together a book proposal, and in writing the proposal, I realized I can do research, via Zoom and just basic kind of internet research, but in order to bring the subject alive, I have to go to the places. And so I started with London before I even submitted the proposal. So I went to London and visited Lloyd's of London, which is really an institution. I mean, it's a brokerage firm that some of the great stories while I was there was, they issued the insurance on the Titanic, which didn't work out well for Lloyd's. It almost bankrupted the company, which is a pattern you see throughout all of these businesses, which is they've all had their kind of near-death experience. But the near-death experience is the thing that actually makes them much stronger. So in London, I spoke with like large financial institutions like Lloyd's, but I also went to Lock & Co. Hatters, which is a hat shop that has been selling hats for about 400 years now, I think since the late 1600s. Berry Brothers Wines, which is right next to Lock & Co., wine shop that's been around for another, 300-400 years. And the process is a little bit, for me, it's both based on the kind of planning and reaching out to places, explaining what I'm working on and setting up official interviews. But very often it's the serendipity of you just show up and you just start talking to the people that work there and even some of the customers. And so I like to leave slack in my own process to allow for the serendipity to occur, because especially if you're dealing with a larger company and you're going through kind of like a corporate communications or a PR department, you're going to get kind of the official boilerplate line from the company. And that's great. I think it's important. And often speaking to the CEO or even the multi-generational owner is very important. But what I'm finding is that speaking to an employee can yield a lot more interesting results, to really understand why that employee still works there, why they like working there, what that employee can say about the multi-generational owner that is either positive or negative, but ultimately I think gives more clues to the question that I'm asking, which is why, right? Why are these places still around? And often, if you're the CEO, you kind of have your kind of canned answer. And I think that finding people outside of that maybe C-suite level yields more compelling perspectives. So it started with London, and then from London, it was Italy, went throughout Italy, and then Japan most recently. I'm going to Australia in a couple of days. I'll be in Switzerland, France, Portugal, and then I'll continue on. I haven't booked the next trips after that, but I'm hoping to cover, a couple dozen countries and 5 continents.
That's amazing. We'll ask later in the episode for, where people can contact you and be helpful on this journey. I know I've not seen anyone do this before. You're open sourcing your research and your journey here. But I want to say up front that, for listeners who know of a company, a location, a place, I know you're open to more explorations. So, please do reach out. That's amazing. So London was the first trip. And then you said Italy was the second. So maybe before we move from London to Italy, that was trip number 1. So as you were on the plane on the way home, what were you writing about? What was sort of sticking with you as we're starting to get some clues as to why these firms have lasted hundreds of years?
Yeah, I think, it goes back to kind of what I mentioned around this idea of crisis, right? Which is like crisis is the thing that strengthens an organization. And I think an individual too. There are certain aphorisms or cliches like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger that are very true on a very deep level. And so London in particular, as I'm sure you know, had a big fire in 1666. And I started really thinking about this idea of this fire that almost destroyed the city. And I spoke with a historian that studied this period of London's history. And what I found was post-fire, the city rebuilt in a completely different way. So there were new regulations passed that no longer allowed thatched roofs. You had to build buildings in certain fire codes that didn't exist before. So that was one. And then again, like the Lloyd's of London example, there are so many little details of that business besides the Titanic one, where it was a culture of kind of like continuous improvement, right? And you see this in a lot of organizations that have a mindset of quality and endurance, which is what can we do just a little bit every day to make things a little bit stronger? So one of the details I loved was at one point they removed the backs of seat chairs in the actual pit of the room. And the reason is because they didn't want the sellers and the buyers to get too comfortable with each other. So they wanted to create really an open market. And so they wanted people to basically sit for a few minutes and talk with the buyers and sellers could talk, but that they wouldn't get too comfy in the chair and, they would go and find another bid on the thing that they were looking to price. And even the physical architecture of the building is constructed. It's a newer building, it's about 30, 40 years old, but they built the building so intentionally that there are no columns in the center of the building. It's like this massive pit where everyone can see each other at all times. So there's this open floor plan that created ultimate transparency. And so, again, it was just this idea of like, there's so many components to why this business is still around. It's not one thing. There's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of little tweaks to the model that consistently make it stronger and more resilient. And then on a much smaller scale, speaking with I'm forgetting the name for someone who makes hats, but the hat maker at Lock & Co., I talked with him quite a bit, and we just discussed this idea of you come and buy a hat, but you create a relationship with that customer, right? And the seller creates the relationship with the customer that's so deep and so personal that their kids will come, their grandkids will come. And so it's a culture that doesn't necessarily prioritize acquiring new customers. It's really a culture that prioritizes serving existing customers, which is a bit counterintuitive to a modern idea of growth, which is we're only as good as our next customer, which we see across all industries. We see it in the investment business, we see it in manufacturing. And so that was kind of a pattern that started to emerge in London. And in fact, even when I skipped one trip in between London and Italy, I did some domestic travel to John Deere, and which is a company that we do own in our portfolio, but it's a company that's been around for about 190 years now. And I spoke with a lot of farmers. I spoke with the executives of the company. And again, I saw that pattern of we're not that focused on the next customer. We're just focusing on what makes our customers happy right now. And how can we ensure that customer is going to stay with us, but that their kids are going to stay with us, their grandkids are going to stay with us. And that's a very different, again, it's a different approach than trying to kind of scale your business by always going after what's next. It's an approach that allows for time to actually do the work of compounding.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I'm thinking about how, one of the many things that's interesting about family relationships is you're with your family your whole life. And so there are just places you won't go and things you won't do because this relationship needs to last. And that's almost the opposite of how any business pursuing high growth operates, where it's just sort of what's the easiest, fastest sale. And if cost to serve or anything else goes up too high, we'll just cut that person, that group, that business. That's very interesting. So let's triple click on the domestic travel. So you went to John Deere. That's a business through friends of mine who work there. I've been fascinated by that bit. I mean, I think most folks know it as the green tractors, which is true, but there's so much under the hood there. So, and I actually don't know much of the history. So say a little more. What
Yeah.
It started 190 years ago and then what?
So it started 190 years ago, not as a tractor company, because tractors didn't exist 190 years ago. It was a plow company. So they just had plows. And I think what's interesting when you study the history is that the introduction of the tractors was kind of met with a lot of, I guess, resistance, because farmers had been farming for many generations in a certain way, and the tractor was kind of seen as this new piece of technology that wasn't necessarily welcomed, right? It was a different way of cultivating the land. But I think what I learn and what I see today is they introduce these new innovations or just new technologies very slowly, right? It's not forced on the customer. They continue to have kind of older models for customers that want to continue to use the old way, but also offer something new. It's like my favorite example is Microsoft Outlook, which, they keep trying to push the new version on me, but there's an option to go back to the old version, and I'm just not ready for the new version. And I think that's a good philosophy to have if you're a business, which is, you do want to create the conditions for change, because if you're not changing, you are going to die. You just have to continually evolve, but to do it slowly and to do it respectfully of your customers' desires and their wishes. And then, one of the other just pieces of its history that I found so compelling was, again, this relationship with customers. And during the Dust Bowl about 100 years ago, when farmers were getting wiped out, John Deere was one of the few American companies that did not go after its farmers to repay their debts to the company. So they forgave debts. And that created a level of trust that still continues to this day. And it also created the conditions that John Deere survived themselves, because inevitably cycles go up and down. There's good years, there's bad years. But by keeping that relationship with the customer intact, as opposed to kind of pushing them and squeezing from them, they embody, to me, a culture that is not extractive. It's really productive. What can we give, right, as opposed to what can we take? And so that's part of their history that I think really continues to this day. And I went and I met with their CTO and their CFO, and I went with my business partner, Dan, and we asked kind of all the questions you would think to ask, which is like, how are they using automation and new software? And what struck me was we've spent a lot of time around technology companies in Silicon Valley. And, the mentality of Silicon Valley companies, like, we've got this great new killer product, customers going to love it, we're rolling it out, we're pushing it out, and we're sunsetting the old version. It was a very different approach at John Deere. It was like, we're going to do this very slowly. In fact, when I asked about automation and this idea that by 2030, we're going to have autonomous tractors, they kind of pushed back and said, we've been doing this for about 30 years now. It started with GPS. So we were the first company to put GPS on our tractors. So the path to automation is really just this really slow evolution, starting in the late 90s with one new technology integration that is slowly turning into something deeper towards the farmer's process. But again, it was just like a different mindset of, and maybe it's obviously part culture. It's a Midwestern company. It's a different customer base. It's obviously not like they're not selling to software engineers. So, but I really appreciated, and I see this pattern across all of these different institutions, is that the way to create resiliency is to just do things incredibly slowly, right? And I think there's that's so counter to the push of modernity, which is to do things quickly, like the whole move fast and break things culture. My concept is like slow down and build things that last, right? And so if you're trying to build something or work on something that compounds over many years, I think you actively have to push against so much of the modern obsession with quickness and growth and being fast and being first. Being first and being fast are often like the seeds of destruction.
Yeah, that's well put. The way you described that approach at John Deere to technology, the first thing that came to mind was the approach to innovation from some of the top Swiss watch manufacturers, where they do innovate, but they do this incredible job of bringing the past with them and preserving what worked and improving what can be improved. But one of the examples I learned about somewhat recently was, so Rolex has innovated in many ways, including on things like the oils that lubricate their mechanical watches. And so that ultimately culminated in things like the service interval for some of their watches going from 5 years to 10. But as watchmakers started to take apart these watches and look and understand the innovations, they found all these other little things that Rolex had done to make the movement better that they didn't even bother telling anyone about. They just did it. And then, of course, you wrap that up in a design language that is iconic, and it was iconic 50 years ago, and I think it's a good bet it will be iconic 50 years from now. And there's that amazing blend of they've not just stayed in the past and sat on their laurels, but equally it's not been, can we constantly recapture customers we already have? It's more let's evolve with our customers in some sense and have a respect for what came before us. And so you're right, that's rather counter to how many things are done these days. So you had some domestic travel, and then tell us about Italy. So, I mean, Italy, I think, many people will have associations with things that are very old that are from Italy, in Italy, come from Italy. But how did you decide where you were going to go, who you were going to visit as you approached that trip?
Yeah, the selection criteria is something that I've thought a lot about, and how to find a mix of companies. So I, first of all, wanted to go to Italy with my wife. So that was reason.
This is a good reason. Yeah.
Yes. It was a trip that she could get behind. So we started in Lake Como. And on Lake Como, if you've ever been there, or you've ever been to any of like the Italian lakes or the Swiss lakes, there's Riva boats. And they're pretty iconic. They're these like beautiful wooden yachts that you see everywhere. And so the first company that I met with was Riva, and I met with Daniele Riva, who's the 6th generation boat builder on Lake Como, and they have a studio and a workshop right on the shore. It's actually next to George Clooney's villa, which you boat right past when you go to his spot. And throughout Italy, I met with, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so companies, starting in Lake Como. Also met with Giuseppe Fontana, who is the lead of the Fontana Gruppo, which is one of Italy's largest manufacturing companies. And he actually owns Via d'Este, which is this resort right on Lake Como. From there, went to Milan, spent time at the oldest bookstore in Milan, which is run by a very charismatic guy named Giorgio Lamberti, who's wonderful. If you're in Milan, you should check it out. It started in 1775. I met up with our mutual friend Luca Delana and went to the oldest restaurant in all of Italy, Il Bagutto, which was founded in 1284. I met with the owner there, Gemma Bosworth. From Milan, I traveled to, and this is, my wife went back to the States. We had my parents taking care of our kids. So then I went off to do my own travel, spend time at Beretta, which is one of the largest gun manufacturers. It's now really a global holding company. It's got about 4,000 employees around the world, but their headquarters is still in Gardone Valtrompia, where they manufacture the iconic Beretta shotguns. I met with Pietro Gusali Beretta, who's the 16th generation CEO and an heir to the Beretta Holdings company. But at Beretta, spent time with a lot of the employees there and got to see the engraving process, went through all the different facilities. From Beretta, went over to Murano, right off Venice, spent time at Barovia in Tasso, which is the oldest Venetian glassmakers in the world. So they were founded in 1295 and make some of the most beautiful glass artwork and chandeliers in the world. In fact, Jeff Bezos was having his wedding a few days before, and as I was walking through one of their showrooms, got to see the chandelier that Jeff purchased for one of his yachts. That's about 30 feet tall, and I guess sits at the center of Jeff's quite large yacht. So that it was pretty decadent, but I really got to spend time like literally in the furnaces with the glass blowers to really see the craft up close and personal. So it was a really special experience, and spent time lastly in Modena, where I visited with Giusti, balsamic vinegar maker since the late 1600s, and also Ferrari, which was a pretty incredible experience to go through the track and see where the cars are manufactured.
So you're hitting, I mean, if I had written down a list of Italian, multi-generational Italian things, it sounds like you hit most of what I would have thought of, and some more. You mentioned multi-generational founders several times there, and so I imagine interviewing one multi-generational founder is very special. But you had many of these in a row, and so I wonder, as you're talking to the third multi-generational founder owner, and then the fourth and the fifth, what was starting to bubble up in your mind where maybe you could say this is just a different kind of person from the normal kind of manager, business operator, owner, founder that you speak with often?
Totally different. It was almost shocking the degree to which it was like a different language than I had been used to for the last 20 years, both as a journalist, talking to CEOs, and as an investor, listening to earnings calls and talking to management at like the C-suite level. The primary difference, I'd say, is there is a real modern fixation and obsession with customers. And I think that's really important. We talked about that with John Deere. But what I'm seeing, especially from the multi-generational owners, is an obsession with keeping the employees not just happy, but feeling like it's truly their home. And that isn't the owners just saying that for the purpose of marketing or just sort of, trying to posture as we take care of our employees, because I talk to the employees. And to give you one example from my meeting at Beretta, I spent a little time with one of the security guards at Beretta, and she was the one that was sort of ferrying me around the different facilities. And we started talking, and I asked her about her life and where she lived, and she said that her mother, grandmother, grandfather, and great-grandmother all worked for Beretta in Gardone-Valtrympia. And I asked her if her daughter, who's 2 years old, if she thinks her daughter will work for Beretta, and she said, "I hope so." And to me, that was such a clear indication that Beretta is not just a company that manufactures really nice guns, and that's why it's been around for a long time. It's because it's created a culture where people really want to stay and they want to be there. You had mentioned the watchmakers, and I think I do this too. You say they innovated, right? Like they did this. Well, who, right? Like which level of the organization are we talking about when they say they? Because what I'm seeing is true innovation often comes from the employees who have been there for many, many years, and often their parents have also worked at the company. So true innovation, as I'm experiencing it from studying these companies, doesn't come from like an external manager or like an innovation team within an organization. It's often from like a frontline worker who's actually doing the work and understands the process, understands the connection of what they're making to the actual customer need. And so that's another real difference that I'm seeing in these multi-generational businesses is a real respect for the common worker and really valuing those people at a really deep level. One of my favorite conversations so far has been with Claudio Stefani Giusti. And to hear him talk, you get the sense that he is completely obsessed with making sure that his employees are happy with what they're doing. And that is how he is optimizing his business. Of course, it's about quality. Of course, it's about managing growth and profitability. But I spoke with maybe 25 of his employees when I spent the day at the company. And they almost uniformly just said, "I just like being here," right? "I just like being here." And that is so different from, I'm not going to name any American companies, but I think you and I probably have friends at a handful of American corporations where that's not the common line you'd hear, which is like, "Oh, I'd love for my kid to work at XYZ corporation." I think that there's a mentality of, it's a good job, I get paid well, and at 5:00 I check out, which is totally admirable. But what I'm seeing is, especially in Italy, there's a culture that really it's not about a work-life balance so much as it is about just having a good life. And work becomes part of that good life. And so at Giusti, everyone cooks lunches together every single day. Again, you can't separate necessarily the business from the culture that they inhabit. And so, they shut down the factory in all of August and everyone goes out to the beach for the whole month. That's a very Italian thing. It works. It works really well. People just rest quite a bit. You take a 2 or 3 hour lunch break, but then you come back. And if you're trying to create something that really compounds, I think that you have to create the conditions for people to just really enjoy their time there and embrace this idea of just slowing down. And you just see the fruits of that everywhere in terms of the quality of the product, the resiliency of the company to experience inevitable downturns. I'll share one final story from Beretta, which was in 1945 when the company basically saw its revenue go completely, I don't know the exact percentage, but after the war, new orders for guns went down quite a bit. And instead of closing up the factory or laying off the workers, as most, I think, American companies would likely do, they decided, well, what can we have our employees do? Let's make cars. So they started making cars for a year. And I'm not sure this is a story that's ever been shared before, but this will be an exclusive on The Art of Quality. But apparently in 1945 or 1946, Mr. Agnelli, the owner of Fiat and Italy's largest car maker, called Mr. Beretta and said, I hear you're making cars now. And Mr. Beretta said yes. And Mr. Agnelli said, well, maybe we'll start making guns. And that was the end of the Beretta car. So it ended there, which to me was a wonderful story on a couple of levels. One, just that, just two Italian magnates going head to head, but also like a real respect for your competition, which you see particularly in Japan and other countries. But this idea of competition is good, and it's not necessarily viewed as competition in some of these cultures. It's viewed as these are necessary parts of the ecosystem. And in order to create resiliency in our own business, we actually need to treat our competitors really well, and not to necessarily just constantly undercut them or try to acquire them if they're in a moment of weakness, but actually help them and be respectful of them, because that creates an equilibrium across the entire system.
Yes, and same with just a few minutes ago with employees as well.
Yeah.
I think about, there are these pieces of this that I think have been grokked in, let's just call it, modern business building, and then pieces of it that have just been completely ignored or missed or not yet explored. So one that came to mind is there are certain types of business builders where there's this ethos of you need to be thinking about the business you're building in the shower, and you need to just be obsessive. You need to live it, breathe it, eat it, sleep it. And it's, I think, somewhat reasonable to think that somebody who actually every mental clock cycle they have and every bit of energy they have being put towards a business versus someone who maybe, goes to work at 9 and goes home at 5, eventually the person that out hustles, out thinks, out whatever, that wins in the long run. What you're saying with how, the employee lifestyle at Beretta and other places, you imagine there's generations of employees who thought about how to make their piece of that business better in the shower. And you imagine compounding over hundreds of years and many generations and so on. And obviously that means you have to do it in a way that's sustainable, and that, people don't leave the business because they just want a little more holiday time or whatever. But in some ways it's kind of, it's, you think of the compounding equation of a certain rate of compounding raised to the power of the number of years you can do it. Things get really powerful when you can raise the number of years you can compound a rate. And almost in the fullness of time, the rate can be even a little lower if the time can be a little longer. And so that all makes sort of intuitive sense in a way that I think we just, don't grok often.
Yeah, I think that for whatever reason, I think we've lost sight of the fact that, let's just start with what is a business. I mean, to me, a business is just a collection of people creating something of value for other people, right? And so I think that in order to have like a good business, you have to have people who feel that they are learning something constantly. And I think so many of modern organizations, we have job titles, right? And we have hierarchy. And so you're a marketing manager. So you just do marketing for this company. You're not really paid to think about other parts of the business. I think in reality, like these really resilient structures, they have less emphasis on particular roles, right? And they have more of this sort of like fluid idea of, yes, this is what you are really, really good at right now, but that could change over time, right? And it isn't necessarily like a path of climbing the corporate ladder, right? That's a very American idea of you start as, associate, then you start moving up and you eventually become a partner. What I'm seeing at these organizations is true mastery through apprenticeship, but the goal of your job is not to move up, it's to become better at what you're doing and understand what the company is actually producing so that you can help the entire organization move forward and improve what like have your little piece that you make it a little bit better, right? And so like to use glass blowers as an example, the guys blowing glass who've been doing it for 40 years, none of them want to be the CEO of the company. They just want to improve the craft. They just want to get a little bit better each day. And that's what they value, right? They value the fact that what they're producing is getting better, not the fact that they have a better job title. And so that's a very, very different idea than so much of like 21st century business and why people work at organizations. So many people, young people want to work somewhere because they believe it's a good path to something else. And that's what we really encourage in schools is you start with this job and then you move up, you move up, you move up. There isn't this idea, as far as I've experienced it, of, yeah, your job is actually just to get better at the thing that you're doing, which is very different. And often people end up, and you hear these stories constantly of, yeah, people end up moving up, but then they're miserable because they're managing people and they don't like to manage people, or they're actually like disconnected from the thing that they really like doing. I think engineers probably experience this the most in many ways, software engineers, mechanical engineers, which is they love being an engineer and then they were very good at it. So they got promoted to a VP and now they're not engineering anymore, right? And so like, what does that do to an organization if that's the culture? Then you have a bunch of people who don't actually want to be doing the jobs that they're doing.
So two things came to mind there. One is if we go back 1,000 years, job titles weren't a thing. Right. And to some extent, working in a business was you do what's needed, and sometimes that's sweeping the floor. Sometimes that's making the thing. Sometimes that's making a sale. And so we've sort of gone through this evolution of no job titles to extreme fragmentation of work into these little things we call job titles. The idea being if you hyper specialize, things get much better. And I suspect, conversation for another time, I suspect we're about to slide back the other direction where the generalist is more needed for the world that we're evolving into and so on. But it comes to mind that that's a very natural structure, particularly if we're in a world of businesses and societies being complex adaptive systems as opposed to just mechanical systems. I think business as a mechanical input, process, output thing is not a bad idea. I think it's easy to see it's a very incomplete articulation of what a business is. And if you sort of work the logic chain all the way to, if this is a mechanical system, we need to plug people in and out of it. And then you get job titles, and then you get the average tenure at a business being 2 years and whatever, and you lose, amongst other things, the ability to really get good for very long. So how do these organizations, something simple like compensation, right? There's like, we're in this framework mostly of you've got to move up and become a VP so you can get paid more.
Yeah.
And, it's reasonable for people to want their lifestyle to, be able to grow if they become excellent at their craft. So did you learn anything about how that works, or just a different way of kind of letting people get good at a thing without having to jump up a ladder?
Yeah, I didn't really get specifically into kind of how much each of these glass blowers was making, but my understanding from the company is that they make a little bit more each year, right? And I think that it's impossible to separate culture and cost of living of the country from the job and its compensation. So if you're in a country or you're in a city where you can afford a nice house and healthcare and have good food at a relatively low cost, the ambition to constantly make more goes down. And I think that's a key part of this equation, which is, understanding the context in which you operate. So if you're an American business in a high price city, of course, you're going to have this question of how do we compensate in order to retain employees. But I think that this is where I think it's an open question, but I do believe that people generally are willing to accept lower compensation as long as they truly enjoy the work, enjoy the people that they work with, and feel valued by the organization. I think that once you go from, if you're making 300, is it that much difference to make 350 if you're miserable? Or if you're making 60, that much different if you're making 80, but you're miserable? And so I think like the question of compensation often just sort of falls to the background of these people who love working there feel well compensated for the work that they're doing, but more important to them is that they enjoy what they're doing. They enjoy the people that they work with. And so I think it just goes back to like more fundamental questions around team structures and creating relationships in the organization And you're right. I mean, 1,000 years ago, there was no 4,000 person company. I mean, you could argue maybe a government essentially functioned as a company. I think that there's a lot of legacy thinking towards the Industrial Revolution mindset, which is, we've got these big factories, and you've written about this, and I think you've thought a lot about these questions of, we've created, in 150 years ago, we created these factories, and so we needed, X amount of people working Y amount of hours to produce Z amount of widgets. And that's just fundamentally changed. The dynamic has changed. And yet we've just kept a lot of these structures in place, the 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. I think that inevitably that's evolving, right? And I think people talk about it as like, well, it's work from home, remote. I think we're still trying to figure out the right balance. But I think that on a very simplistic level, the key determinant in many ways of the longevity of your organization probably could be measured as a direct result of how much your employees like each other and like working there and just don't really consider it work.
It's a really good point. Buffett says, figure out how to do the job that you would do for free. And if you can, to some extent, foster those conditions, and then to your point, pay so that people can have a reasonable lifestyle, but a big piece of that being their day is spent doing the thing that they enjoy doing anyway, with people they enjoy being around. It's almost so simple it's laughable. I think it's almost so simple that this has to be a revelation. But
I think it's like I'm trying to get out of this mindset of like businesses are different from life, because how we spend our time is just how we spend our time. And so when we think about like what we actually enjoy doing, for me, it's spending time with my family, spending time with friends. And if you can really create truly a culture where that's what it feels like when you step into the office, that really creates the conditions to create a resilient model. And in Japan, I didn't get to go this trip, but there's this sake brewery where the workers sing together as they mash the rice and water. And the singing functions really on two levels. One, it's just an activity to do together with your coworkers, but it's also the amount of time it takes to actually brew the sake to the correct amount of, like the actual brewing process. So what I'm seeing is, you look at American or even just like Western knowledge workers, people are sitting at computers, staring at their screens, often sitting 4 feet next to their colleague, but not actually interacting with their colleague, or maybe they're sending their colleague a Slack message, even though they're 2 feet away. Those are not good conditions, I think, to create like a long-term model. I think inevitably you just suffer from burnout. I think what we're so missing as like fundamental humanity is connection with each other. We've entirely eroded this idea of community, this idea of traditions. And so what I'm seeing across the research is that these are businesses, yes, but they're really kind of organizational structures or just communities that have traditions and that have friendships and familial-like relationships. And it's again, not that complicated. Like you create, in my metaphor, it's a garden. And if you're the owner of this business, you're the caretaker for that garden. And there, of course, is impermanence and there's change, but it's an ecosystem that all parts of the ecosystem must work together for it to create a thing of beauty. And I think it's very easy to kind of become a little short-sighted or just forget how different the world looks now than it did 100 years ago. And not to say that 100 years ago things were great, because I would much rather live in today's world than 100 years ago. I wouldn't be alive if I was, if I had my health crisis 100 years ago. So this isn't, a Luddite perspective of let's just go back to the past. But I think this connection that we have to technology and our kind of obsession with working constantly with our computers and devices and not our hands and with each other is a real kind of detriment to our own health and longevity. And a lot of, I think, American and Western companies think about, how do we have more like team unison or fun times for our employees? And so we'll do like a monthly, get together and do happy hour once a month. But that often, to me, I feel like misses the point, right? Like the fun should be every day. It shouldn't just be relegated to, okay, every Thursday night we're going to go have some beers and do trivia, which can be great. But wouldn't you rather just kind of rewire the entire organization so that when people arrive, they feel good and not like they have to blow off steam and end up getting too drunk at an open bar and, starting to gossip with their coworkers, which inevitably happens at all company events. The Christmas party should be studied for years in the American organization, because that's where all the truth comes out.
It's a good thought, though. It makes total sense that if your structure is, we need to have this event or this weekly whatever retreat as some sort of relief valve or as something to help keep us going, you've probably in some sense already lost, right? And so if that's what it takes to keep people there and to motivate good work, then you probably have much deeper problems. Although I agree with you in that is rampant, right?
Yeah.
It's almost more common than not, at least in the places that we tend to hang out. So take us to Japan. So I'm thinking this whole conversation, we've been winding our way backwards in time.
Yeah.
And I believe you're going to tell us that the oldest business that we know of is in Japan, but take us there. So you did Italy, then you went to Japan. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So I just got back from Japan a few days ago. So this is all quite fresh, and I am open sourcing this as I go, because I just believe fundamentally that, I guess on a very fundamental level, I like sharing it as I go. And it's fun for me to have these conversations publicly and privately. And I'm learning a lot by having these conversations. And I think a lot about authors that have spent 2-3 years writing something in, a cave or in a cabin somewhere. And then, you come out with the book, and I'm just approaching it in a totally different way that feels more intuitive to what I like to do. So with that in mind, I went to Japan, I went to Kyoto, largely because I've been just fascinated by Japanese culture, because Japan has the highest number of shinise, which are long-lived companies. There's about 33,000 companies in Japan that are over 200 years old. And
that many?
Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah. I'm trying to have some guess. I don't know the number, but what even the population of Japan was 200 years ago. And that's incredible.
Yeah. And I think if you look at that number in the US, over 200 years old, I think it's less than 100. So, these are orders of magnitude difference. And obviously it's a much older country, so it's not really apples to apples. But I think Japan, to me, I read a lot about Japanese culture, spoken to a number of people who have studied this. I have a research counterpart in Japan, a guy named Yuji Yamada, who's great. He's written a book about Japanese businesses. So I mostly wanted to go to Japan, but even before I met a lot of these companies, to understand Japanese culture better and just to understand the history of Japan, get deeper into Shintoism, Buddhism, the conditions in which people are maintaining these businesses. And so I'll give a couple of examples of companies that I went to visit. One was Suen Tea, which is the oldest tea shop in the world. It was founded in the year 1160, so almost 1,000 years old. It's run by the 24th generation, Yusuke Suen. And I had tea with him in his shop on the bank of the Uji River, which is just a couple miles from where the Nintendo Museum is, actually. And so I've been asking all of these multi-generational owners basically the same few questions, which is like, what is it? Why are you still around? Like, what's going on here? And he paused pretty reflectively and just said, we really respect our ancestors. Like, we have a real respect for our ancestors and a care for them. And I think that when I think about how I grew up, and I think a lot of my American friends, we're a new country and we don't really have a connection to our ancestors. And I know the vague story of what happened to my great-grandparents, which was they left Romania and they left Russia. Things were bad. They came to the US. That's all I know. And there's been a history that's really forgotten. So I think in the loss of that history, I think we lose respect for it because it's just not present in our minds growing up. We don't really think about our ancestors very often, unless you really grew up in a traditional, maybe religious household that really honors the family line. I didn't grow up that way. Most people I know don't really grow up thinking about their ancestors constantly. I think Japanese culture is quite different, especially if you're in a family business like this. So that would be number one, is just a real respect for ancestors and tradition. And then also I think it's hard to separate the culture and the I wouldn't really call them religious beliefs, but maybe cultural beliefs around Shintoism. Shintoism isn't a religion per se, but there's a fundamental belief that all things have some level of value or even consciousness. And so there's a deep respect for things. There's a deep respect for trees and dirt and rocks and buildings. And so when you have such a respect for things in a way that I think a lot of Western folks think of things as somewhat disposable and changeable, you embed an idea of maintenance into everything that you do. So you maintain systems. Some of the oldest temples, which were built by Kongogumi, which is one of the largest construction companies, that was the oldest company in the world until it was bought out. They didn't build buildings necessarily that would last forever. They built buildings and temples that would be maintained every 500-600 years. And so
that's wild, just that statement, we're going to build this thing and we're going to have a 500-year maintenance cycle.
Right.
It's just wild.
Right. And these are, temples that were built without any nails or any metal whatsoever. So there's like a profound respect for the physical objects in our lives, which then I think like kind of translates into what you see, and I think people experience with Japanese products is just the level of quality, right? We're talking on a podcast about the art of quality. So like, what is it that creates the conditions for quality? That's something that I spoke with a lot of folks in Japan about. And to me, I think the takeaway was there's this idea of just true mastery through apprenticeship. I was at Kaikaido, which is one of the older tea caddy shops that makes these beautiful tea canisters. And I spoke with one of the craftsmen, and he's 5 years into a 10-year apprenticeship, right? And I mean, beyond maybe like brain surgeons, it's hard for me to think about crafts or just professions in Western culture or modern culture that have that level of apprenticeship. I mean, very, very few. And so there's just this obsession with doing things the correct way. I think even if you go into the geography of Japan, one of the historians that I spoke with suggested that part of Japan's, I think, emphasis on quality is that it's an island country. And for many years, they didn't have the ability to just import goods from another place. It was very self-sustaining, right? And so if you have a totally self-sustaining culture, you have to make something that can last a long time, because you can't, these things, I'm holding up a smartphone, your smartphone breaks, you get a new one in 2 years, right? That's not really the mindset of a culture in which there's no boat coming with new products every day, right? There's no train that's going to arrive with the new product that you can buy. So the things that you make have to be really high quality, and they have to last, and you have to maintain them. So I think that's just a big part of it. I mean, there's so many elements, and I would be foolish to say I figured it out after one 10-day trip to Japan. But I think that the patterns and the mosaic of pattern is becoming a little bit more clear to me.
Yeah. So that makes sense. You mentioned that what was the world's oldest construction company was bought out. And so this strikes me as an important story, a company that made it nearly, 1,000 years didn't.
More than that. Yeah.
More than, yeah. So what's the story there?
So to be totally candid, I'm looking to get deeper into the story because there isn't really that much publicly available information, and I'm trying to find out what's going on behind the scenes. But I believe in 2006, a larger construction company bought Kongogumi. As far as I know, and I've talked to a few people about this, that the family actually still, that had run Kongogumi for many years, is still kind of working with the acquiring company. But this is one of those mysteries that I'm actively in pursuit of. And this is what happens when you record podcasts when you're not done with the book, is you don't have all the answers.
This is why we call this notes from the field. It's I mean, that's how you're finding what to chase, I imagine, is
and also it's helpful for me in having these conversations, in hearing your questions, because it's a clear indicator to me of like what's interesting to other people. And that is helping me kind of like tune my antenna up to what it's like. Yeah, Kongogumi got bought out. I knew that was interesting personally, but the fact that you're pushing on it is this sort of like meta idea of like, oh, I need to push on this a little bit deeper too. I need to investigate further.
Yeah, well, maybe in service of that thread of what else to push on, I'm trying to think about what it might feel like or be like to grow up in a family where your father did a thing or does a thing and you watch that, and your grandfather did that thing, and your great-grandfather and your great-great, and there's probably, without anyone even having to say anything, there's this, assumption or a thing to deal with of that's probably my path. And I find it unlikely that if you're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 plus generations, there weren't generations within there who maybe wanted to do their own thing or wanted to do it in their own way. And yet the business survives to the 11th and the 12th and the 13th generation. So what have you learned about that so far?
It's such a good question. And it's so the other side of the coin of this respect for ancestors, right? Which is, how do you have a concept of your own individuality when you are so tied to this thing that your family has been doing for so many generations? And I met with the 47th generation of Hoshi Ryokan, which is the oldest business in the world. And it's a woman whose name is now Zengoro Hoshi, because when you become the official owner of Hoshi Ryokan, you become Zengoro. But before that, she was Heisei Hoshi. And I think that she, to me, was a story about a woman who did not think that she would actually take over this business, and frankly, didn't really want to. Her father, who was the 46th generation, was a pretty strong character and was really quite well known for running this business. Her brother was supposed to take over the business. And so that's how she grew up, knowing that her brother would take it over. And so she left, she moved to Tokyo. She worked in a doctor's office. She had a life that she enjoyed. And then her brother died. And so the call went out of, well, you have to come home and take the business. And it's really hard because it's such an emotional conversation, and she is the leader now. So I think that she's probably resistant in some ways to being super candid about this. But my impression is that it was a really tough decision to have to go back and take on this challenge and this legacy that she didn't necessarily think that she was going to be the one. So when I asked her what she hopes for the next generation or what she hopes to contribute, her answer was, I just want to pass it off to the next generation. Like, that is why I'm here. I want to keep it alive and I want to pass it off. And she wants to pass it to her nephew. So I think as much as I am impressed and celebrate this idea of multi-generational ownership, if you're listening to this and you are yourself, a multi-generational owner, you know that how challenging that is. Because I've had so many conversations about this, which is a lot of people feel imprisoned by the family business and don't want to necessarily take up the mantle. The TV show Succession, it's in some ways, I think, very funny and brilliant, but all 3 kids, or really all 4 kids, do want to take on the role, right? And I think that that's actually not really true in how most of these businesses operate. And maybe it's different because this is, that's a multi-billion-dollar business and it's maybe prestigious. And some of the businesses I'm talking to are quite smaller and sort of less prestigious, quote unquote. But I think the more truthful analysis of the multi-generational succession question is often the heir that doesn't want it is the heir that gets it. And they might be the best person for it. And sometimes the person who wants it isn't the right person for it. But almost uniformly, the conversations go something like, I just don't want to be the one that screws it up, right? It's so much pressure.
That's so interesting. I mean, we see many versions of that in many places in many ways, just not typically with, I need to keep the family business going. But I can't imagine what, being the 25th generation in a business feels like. I mean, that's really incredible.
Yeah. I've met with a handful, quite a few of these folks, and I'm hoping that over time, I can really, for me, this is not just a book, but it's like a lifelong project. And I think that so many multi-generational owners have their guard up when they talk about this, right? Because of course you would. I mean, you're representing this kind of institution that means a lot to people, not just your own family, but your employees, your customers. And so very rarely, I think, would you have someone that says publicly, yeah, I don't want this. I think I've had a lot of private conversations, off the record conversations with people who have basically said that. So it's really challenging to write about this because I'm trying to do it, I'm really trying to do like a deep exploration, a deep investigation, but getting people on the record to talk about this is really challenging. And so, I think that's also why I'm doing this so publicly, which is putting out the bat signal of, if you're listening and if this strikes you as true and you have a personal story about this, I'm very curious to speak with people who can be really candidly honest about really maybe pressure test a lot of my own theses around these multi-generational businesses, that instead of like, what is my project really celebrating? Is it celebrating being 15th generation? I don't know. There's a lot of pain and trauma that goes with that. There's a lot of, I think, people who grow up not being able to do the thing that they really wanted to do because they took on that mantle. And obviously this represents like a very small percentage of the world that has this opportunity to go work at a family business. But I think it's instructive to think about because everyone grows up in a community or with a family that has ideas of what you should do or what you shouldn't do. And how do you break free from that? How do you conform to it? Like, what's the piece of wisdom that we can get from studying these institutions to understand when to break free from it, but also like when to lean in to the community, to the tradition, to the family, and navigating that, I think is a really, that's the trickiest balance, right? I think we all want to make our family and our parents and our community proud, but what they think is the right thing for us might not often be the right thing for us.
Yeah. And that's, just by virtue of the fact that we began this conversation with the observation that a database of, the oldest businesses doesn't exist, it follows that a collection of wisdom in answering questions and challenging problems like you just articulated does not yet exist. And so, it's so encouraging and exciting to be in some ways on the frontier of, collecting knowledge that, I think is easy to see why it's valuable, and through your research, hasn't yet been collected. So that's wonderful. So tell us more. Tell us about the book, and namely, or include, what help are you looking for? You mentioned you're open sourcing your research, and then how people can get involved if they want to. How can they contact you?
Yeah, I have a website. It's called outlastbook.com. that just has some pretty basic information about what I'm working on. There's a sign up for my newsletter where I'm sharing a field report each week, in addition to articles and interviews that I'm reading. Your latest Scenius post will be in the Nightcrawler this week. Probably won't get out this week, but so people can sign up there. And as far as what I'm looking for or need, I'm really looking to get into like real personal stories of people who have experience working either for or as a multi-generational owner of a longstanding business or institution. And so if there's people in the audience that have that experience and feel like, that story hasn't really been told in a way that they feel represents their own experience, I would love to talk to them. So people can email me. It's eric@outlastbook.com. Follow me on Twitter. I keep my DMs open. I'm still in the sort of gathering phase as I write it. And for me, that's been one of the primary ways of expanding my own research aperture, is just being public about it. It's just helping me through having these conversations really distill what I'm actually looking for.
Yeah, I love that. And we'll put that information in the show notes too, so it's easy to click on and access. But thank you for that. And as your first time on The Art of Quality, we have a closing question we ask everyone, which is a perfect way to end a conversation like this, which is, what is your most memorable experience with capital Q quality?
I think because it's so fresh in my mind, it was when I was at Barovier in Tasso, the glass blowers on Murano. I was watching the master glass blower literally blow into the tube to create the glass. It was during an Italian heat wave, so it was about 150 degrees in this room with the furnaces, just blasting heat. And everyone's dripping sweat. And one of the associates that was kind of taking me around, she turned to me and she said, every time he blows into the glass, he blows a piece of his soul into the work. And I just let that kind of linger in my head. And I was thinking about that on the flight home. And I keep thinking about that, which is, that's quality. When someone is breathing a piece of their soul into the work. And I think we all work on things in our day-to-day life where that idea sounds kind of nuts. But if you actually start embodying the fundamental idea of it, whether it's an email that you're writing or a spreadsheet that you're creating, or, you're an architect and you're drawing plans for a house, if you really breathe a piece of your soul into the work, that's quality.
What an answer. I will remember that for a long time. And I the audience can't see this, but I'm nodding vigorously.
I think it's not even so much prescriptive of how to do something. I think it's more just kind of a philosophy to how you approach relationships, work, family, your own body, health. I'm very much, my inspiration goes back to growing up Jewish. There's an idea of tikkun olam, which is the purpose of life, is to repair a broken world. How do you do that? I think it's to me, I got a slice of that, which is if you just put a piece of your soul into everything that you do, the world could be a little bit of a better place.
I think there are many layers of wisdom in that idea.
Thank you.
Well, this has been fun. Thank you for everything you've shared. Thank you for kind of cracking open the process and letting us see a little bit of what this journey looks like. Of course, we're excited for the book when it comes out, but we're also grateful that we're able to come along on the journey with you in a sense. We intend to do this again after you've traveled to a few more places and get some more stories, but let's wrap here and thank you again.
Yeah, John, this was awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening. For more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co. If you know someone who would be a good fit for this format, please reach out.